The night was heavy with silence, the kind that seemed to press against the walls and muffle even the faintest breath. In the royal bedchamber, a single oil lamp cast a wavering halo of gold upon embroidered draperies. The king, wrapped in the deep slumber of one who believes himself untouchable, lay still beneath layers of silk and fur. Outside, the palace slept too, its stone corridors dim and empty, save for the occasional footstep of a guard making his slow patrol. But in one of those corridors, footsteps were not a guard's. They were slow, deliberate, and soundless, save for the whisper of leather against flagstone. The figure moved in the darkness as if born of it, his breath measured, his heartbeat steady by force of will. Beneath his cloak he carried something small yet decisive, a blade honed for a single, fatal purpose. As he neared the guarded threshold of the king's private chambers, every fiber of his being was coiled for the act that would make his name both cursed and immortal. We freeze the scene. The blade gleams in the half-light, caught mid-swing in a moment that will change the fate of a kingdom. The screen fades to black, and the story rewinds. The kingdom before the blade. To understand this night, we must first understand the world that made it possible. This was not a land of peaceful succession or quiet diplomacy. This was a kingdom forged in the fires of conquest and bound together by the will of one man, a king who had seized the throne through blood and brilliance. His reign, though marked by victories, was also a reign of enemies, nobles he had humiliated, foreign rulers he had outmaneuvered, and generals who once commanded armies, now forced into ceremonial roles. The capital itself was a marvel of its time. Towering stone walls ringed the city, wide avenues cut through bustling markets, and above all stood the citadel, an architectural statement of power. It was both fortress and palace, designed to deter invasion and dazzle subjects into loyalty. But grandeur often hides fragility. Inside those walls, politics simmered like a pot never removed from the fire. Every courtier had a secret allegiance, every smile could conceal a dagger, and every act of mercy was calculated. The king's rise, the man now sleeping so peacefully, had not been born to the crown. His youth was one of hardship and survival. He had served as a soldier before he ever wore the crown, a commander who understood not only how to win a battle, but how to win the loyalty of men. The chronicles record his campaigns against neighboring kingdoms with almost reverent awe, lightning-fast cavalry charges, cunning feints that lured larger armies into traps, and sieges that ended in days rather than months. Yet these same victories bred resentment. Each defeated rival left behind survivors, nobles stripped of lands, foreign princes forced into exile, mercenaries left unpaid. His ascension to the throne was not a peaceful transition, but a calculated gamble in which the losing side had been crushed, not forgiven. That wound never truly healed in the kingdom's political body. The enemy within this was the soil in which the assassin's plan took root. Outside the palace walls, many dreamed of the king's downfall, but it was inside that the most dangerous seeds were sown. Among the king's own circle were those who smiled in daylight and plotted in darkness. The assassin was no foreign mercenary, he was a man of the court, one who had dined in the king's presence, listened to his confidences, and walked the palace halls without suspicion. The identity of this figure remained shrouded in layers of historical debate. Chroniclers of the time disagree on his origins, some claim he was a wronged noble seeking revenge, others insist he was the pawn of a rival kingdom's agents. But all agree on one thing: he was not an outsider breaking in. He was already inside, trusted and invisible. Tension at court. In the weeks leading to that fateful night, the palace hummed with subtle tension. Messengers came and went more often than usual. The king held private meetings behind closed doors with his most loyal generals. There were whispers of an impending war, the name of a rival power murmured in the shadows of colonnades. For the assassin, each day was a test of patience and discipline. Every banquet, every ceremonial procession was an opportunity, yet also a risk. One premature move, one careless glance toward the dagger hidden in his chambers, and the plot would unravel. But as the political climate grew more volatile, the assassin's sense of urgency sharpened. It was no longer merely about revenge or ambition. It was about striking before events beyond his control took the chance from him. The last sunset the day of the assassination began without omen. The king, unaware of his mortal peril, attended to matters of state, reviewing troop deployments, approving trade agreements, and settling disputes between nobles. As the sun dipped below the city walls, painting the sky in hues of copper and blood, the palace settled into its nightly rhythms. Servants lit the lamps in the halls, guards took their posts, and musicians' last notes faded into the quiet of the evening. Somewhere in those moments, the assassin made his final preparations. The blade was sharpened to a lethal edge, wrapped in cloth to mute its presence. He donned clothing that would not rustle or catch the light. Every step of the plan was committed to memory, the timing of the guards, the creak in the third stair, the exact distance from the door to the bed. Returning to the blade, and so we return to that frozen moment, the assassin standing at the king's bedside, the air heavy with the stillness before an irreversible act. The story of how these two men came to this point is as much about the age they lived in as it is about them, a kingdom balanced on the edge of war, a ruler both feared and revered, and a man who chose the most intimate and dangerous path to alter history, striking his king in his sleep. The blade begins to fall. But before it lands, we must step deeper into the tangled web of betrayal, politics, and ambition that led to this night. The palace in daylight was a theater of grandeur, marble columns, frescoed ceilings, and courtyards where fountains whispered over polished stone. Yet beneath the sunlight and ceremony, a darker play unfolded, one written in whispers, nods, and carefully measured silences. It was here, in the heart of royal power, that the seeds of regicide were nurtured. The assassin's place in the royal circle, the man who now carried death in his heart, was no stranger to the king. He was a fixture in court life, his presence so familiar that no one looked twice when he passed. He had once been a soldier, rising through the ranks not by brute strength but by keen intelligence. His wit and ability to read a man's intentions had earned him the trust of nobles and generals alike. When the king noticed him, it was not for his sword arm but for his mind. He was brought into the royal circle as a trusted aide, a position that gave him proximity to power, but also to the bitter rivalries and dangerous undercurrents that ran beneath the surface. In those shadowed corridors of influence, loyalty was a currency often spent and rarely repaid. Court politics and the brewing storm, the king's court was a web of factions. On one side were the loyalists, military commanders and ministers whose fortunes had risen with the king's. On the other were those who had bent the knee only under duress, biding their time until the right moment to strike. The assassin moved between these worlds with ease, a bridge that neither side saw as a threat. But within the council chambers, tempers often flared. Disputes over taxation, troop movements, and alliances were not mere policy disagreements, they were veiled struggles for control of the crown itself. The king, proud and often uncompromising, made enemies with every decree. The assassin, observing from the periphery, took note of each insult delivered and each noble who clenched his jaw at the king's commands. The turning point, what transformed the assassin's quiet discontent into a lethal resolve, is still debated by historians. Some claim it was a personal betrayal, that the king had promised him land or title and then rescinded it in favor of another courtier. Others believe it was ideological, that the assassin believed the king's wars were bleeding the kingdom dry for personal glory. There are even chroniclers who whisper of an external influence, a covert approach from a foreign envoy who offered gold and safe passage in exchange for the king's life. Whatever the truth, something shifted. The assassin stopped merely recording slights in his memory and began to plan. The choice to kill a king is not made lightly, it is a step into a world from which there is no return. Yet once he took it, the assassin moved with quiet determination, like a man walking toward a destination already decided in his heart. The web of betrayal plots against kings rarely unfold alone. Allies are required, for information, for resources, for covering one's tracks. The assassin found his in the disillusioned corners of the court, a chamberlain with debts to foreign merchants, a guard overlooked for promotion, a dismissed advisor whose influence had waned. Each played their part, knowingly or not, in smoothing the assassin's path toward the royal bedchamber. But trust among conspirators is fragile. Every whisper carried the risk of discovery. Every meeting in the quiet alcoves of the palace gardens felt like balancing on a knife's edge. Yet the assassin's calm demeanor masked the storm beneath. He spoke to the king daily, delivering reports, relaying messages, even laughing at the ruler's jests, all while rehearsing in his mind the swift arc of the blade. The decision to strike in the final days before the assassination, tension in the court reached a fever pitch. A neighboring kingdom had begun moving troops toward the border, prompting urgent war councils. The king, sensing the threat, doubled down on his military preparations. But the assassin saw opportunity. With the court's attention consumed by the looming conflict, palace security focused outward, not inward. On the night chosen for the deed, there was no fanfare, no final farewell to his co-conspirators, only a silent understanding: if he succeeded, the kingdom would awaken to chaos; if he failed, his body would hang from the palace gates by dawn. Either way, the die was cast. And as the sun set over the citadel's spires, painting the marble in shades of crimson and gold, the assassin began the quiet walk toward destiny, and toward the chamber where the king's life would end before another dawn. The kingdom did not exist in a vacuum. Every stone of its citadel, every gold coin in its treasury, was hard-won through centuries of war and uneasy truces. The king's reign had been defined by the sword, and it was the weight of these wars that would make his assassination a seismic event. The king's military legacy: long before he wore the crown, the king had been a commander whose strategies were studied and feared across the known world. His cavalry was famed for its discipline, its riders moving as one body, able to feint and encircle enemies in a single, fluid motion. His infantry formations, shield walls reinforced by archers in staggered ranks, had broken armies twice their size. These victories were not merely about defending borders. The king's ambitions pushed far beyond the kingdom's natural boundaries, seizing resource-rich territories, controlling trade routes, and imposing his authority over smaller vassal states. The crown's wealth swelled, as did its list of enemies. The war at the doorstep: by the year of his death, the kingdom was poised for yet another campaign. Along the eastern frontier, a rival empire had begun gathering troops, testing the border with small skirmishes and raids. Intelligence reports spoke of siege engines under construction, of emissaries sent to the kingdom's discontented vassals, of gold changing hands to buy betrayal. Inside the court, this looming threat fueled long debates. Some advisors pressed for immediate mobilization, others urged diplomacy. The king, true to his nature, leaned toward decisive action. Orders were drawn up to muster the army. Smithies worked through the night forging spearheads, and granaries prepared for the strain of feeding thousands of marching men. The assassin's perspective: for the assassin, the coming war was both a danger and an opportunity. Danger, because in wartime the king's personal guard would be doubled, his movements restricted. Opportunity, because the distraction of mobilization thinned the vigilance within the palace itself. More crucially, the war offered a moral justification for his act, at least in his own mind. Removing the king now, before he could launch another costly campaign, could be framed as an act of salvation for the realm. Whether this reasoning was genuine conviction or self-deception, history cannot say. What is clear is that the assassin saw the convergence of external threat and internal unrest as a narrow window in which his strike could have maximum effect. The knife that could end a war, or start one in ancient warfare; the death of a ruler could collapse a campaign before it began, or ignite it into a firestorm. The assassin understood this well. If the king fell, the war councils would descend into factional chaos. Some generals might sue for peace, others might rush to avenge him with reckless force. Either path could alter the map of the region for generations. It is this duality, the possibility of ending a war or beginning a greater one, that gave the assassination its historical weight. The act would not simply kill a man, it could shift the balance of power between kingdoms, topple alliances, and rewrite the destiny of thousands. In the assassin's mind, the stage was set: a king distracted by war, a palace with its guard lowered inward, and a kingdom standing unknowingly at the edge of a blade. The next move would be made not on the battlefield, but in the silence of a royal chamber. Night had descended upon the capital like a slow-closing fist. The moon hung low, half veiled by drifting clouds, its pale light pooling across the palace courtyards. Inside, the flicker of torches cast wavering shadows along corridors that twisted like the innards of some ancient beast. The air was heavy, with the scent of tallow smoke, with the muffled echo of boots on stone, and with something harder to name, the stillness before a storm. The assassin's preparations. The assassin knew every step of the plan as though it were a ritual. He had studied the palace for months, the guard rotations, the blind spots in the torchlight, the patterns of servants delivering water or tending to the lamps. He dressed for silence, dark wool that would not catch the light, soft leather boots that would not betray him to the echoing halls. The blade was wrapped in a strip of cloth not to protect it, but to protect him, from the metallic whisper it might give in the stillness. In his mind he replayed the sequence, through the side corridor by the kitchens, past the ornamental garden that the night guards rarely patrolled, up the narrow service stair to the private chambers. Each step had been rehearsed in fragments, never in full, so that no one moment before this night would seem suspicious. Palace security, and its flaws for all its grandeur, the palace was not impregnable. Like any fortress designed to impress as much as to defend, its weakest points lay in the assumptions of those who felt safe within. The king's chambers were guarded, yes, but not against those already trusted inside the palace walls. Guards at the main entrance knew the assassin by sight, a nod was enough to pass without question. Inside, the corridors near the royal wing were dimmer than the rest of the palace, an economy of oil in hours when the king slept. In such darkness, the human eye becomes both keen and blind, shapes recognized more by habit than by scrutiny. The final approach. The assassin's breath was steady, his heartbeat slowed by deliberate control. He passed two guards on their slow patrol, murmuring a casual greeting as though he belonged there, because he did. His hand brushed the hilt beneath his cloak, a grounding reminder of purpose. At the end of the corridor the royal antechamber loomed. This was the threshold between the living king and the silent memory of him. Beyond that door, the man who commanded armies and decided the fate of nations lay in a vulnerable sprawl of sleep. A lone sentry guarded the antechamber, leaning lazily against his spear. The assassin's approach was measured, not too fast to draw suspicion, not too slow to seem hesitant. A brief exchange, some pretext about delivering an urgent message, a flash of a seal that had once been genuine but now was a tool of deception, and the sentry stepped aside. Inside the chamber, the king's bedchamber was vast, a hall unto itself with high vaulted ceilings and heavy draperies that muffled sound. An oil lamp burned low on a side table, its light a soft pool that barely reached the canopied bed. The smell of lavender clung to the air, the scent of the sachets placed beneath the pillows to ease the king's sleep. The assassin closed the door behind him, the click of the latch almost too loud in the stillness. Each step toward the bed seemed to stretch into eternity. He could hear the slow, rhythmic breathing of the king, the sound at once human and monumental, the pulse of a realm contained in the chest of one man. The blade falls. He reached the bedside. In the dim light, the king's face was both softened and strange, stripped of the authority it bore by day. Here was no commanding presence, no voice that could rally an army, only a man, warm and mortal, as fragile as any other. The assassin's hand moved with precision. The cloth came away from the blade, metal gleamed faintly in the lamplight. For one heartbeat there was only silence. Then, with the inevitability of an arrow loosed from the bow, the blade descended. What happened in that instant, whether the king stirred, whether the assassin's eyes met his, is lost to history. Chroniclers disagree, some say the king never woke, others that he saw his killer's face in the final moment. But all agree that the strike was swift, its purpose certain. The escape. There was no time for reflection. The assassin wiped the blade, rewrapped it, and moved back toward the door. In the stillness he could already hear the faint, distant sounds of the palace, a guard's cough, the shuffle of footsteps far down the hall, and knew that soon that stillness would break into chaos. He slipped out into the corridor, passing the sentry once more, his expression unchanged. Each step carried him farther from the bedchamber, yet closer to the reckoning that awaited him at dawn. The king was dead. The kingdom, though it did not yet know it, had entered a new and dangerous chapter. For a time after the assassin's departure, the king's chambers remained cloaked in silence. The guards outside noticed nothing unusual, their minds dulled by the slow hours before dawn. But the illusion shattered when a servant entered to tend the morning lamps earlier than expected. The scream that followed cut through the corridors like steel. Guards rushed in, torches flaring, revealing the scene in its unalterable truth. The king lay motionless, his chest still, his skin already cooling in the night air. The bedclothes were stained in a spreading shadow of red. The alarm spreads within minutes, the entire royal wing was in chaos. Orders were shouted, weapons drawn, doors barred. Messengers sprinted through the halls to rouse the council. Outside the palace, the city remained unaware, its streets still quiet, but within the citadel, the news spread with terrible speed. The captain of the guard took control, sealing the palace gates. No one was to enter or leave. Courtiers, servants, and soldiers alike were herded into the great hall to be questioned. The air buzzed with fear, not only of the assassins still at large, but of the power vacuum yawning open above them. The assassin's fate. The assassin had planned for this moment, the scramble, the confusion, but even the most meticulous plans are prey to chance. Some accounts claim he escaped the palace before the alarm was raised, vanishing into the city's maze of alleys. Others say he was captured within hours, dragged before the council, defiant even as the sentence was passed. The truth remains debated, but one fact is clear: whether he lived another day or not, his act had already severed the head of the kingdom in more ways than one. Shockwaves through the court. The king's death did not simply remove a ruler, it dismantled the fragile balance of power he had maintained. Generals who had once taken orders without question now eyed each other with suspicion, wondering who would claim the throne. Nobles whispered in corners, weighing alliances, calculating whether loyalty to the royal family or a bid for their own dominance would serve them better. The war councils fell into disarray. Without the king's unifying authority, plans to confront the eastern threat stalled. Some commanders urged an immediate retreat to secure the homeland, others pushed for an aggressive campaign to prove the kingdom's strength had not faltered. The people's reaction: by midday, word had seeped beyond the palace walls. The city reacted with a mixture of disbelief and dread. Merchants shuttered their shops, fearing riots. Mothers pulled their children indoors. Priests called for prayers, warning of divine retribution if justice for the king's death was not swift. Rumors multiplied faster than the truth could keep pace. Some claimed foreign assassins had struck, others insisted it was the work of a traitorous noble. Few believed the king had simply fallen to a lone man with a blade, for in the minds of the people such a ruler could only be felled by forces as vast as those he had once commanded. The palace, once the center of order, had become a hive of suspicion and fear. And in that charged air, the question hung over every council meeting, every whispered conversation, every guarded glance: who will rule now? The king's death did not end with the closing of his eyes, it reverberated outward, echoing through decades, reshaping the kingdom and the world beyond. The struggle for the throne. In the immediate weeks after the assassination, the court became a battlefield without swords. Claims to the throne came from multiple quarters: the king's surviving relatives, generals who had sworn loyalty only to his command, and ambitious nobles who saw opportunity in the chaos. Each faction declared itself the kingdom's savior while accusing the others of treachery. The assassin's act, whether meant to end tyranny or settle a personal vendetta, had set the stage for something far bloodier, a civil conflict that, in some regions, would prove more destructive than the wars the king had waged. Shifting the balance of power outside the borders, rival states moved swiftly. The eastern power that had threatened invasion seized the moment, pushing its armies into disputed territory. Vassal states tested their own independence, some declaring themselves free from the crown's authority. Trade routes shifted, alliances crumbled, and the once unassailable kingdom became a fractured map of competing interests. Historians later noted that the assassination had changed not only the fate of one realm but the entire balance of power in the region. The fall of a single man had opened a vacuum into which nations, armies, and opportunists rushed. The assassin's legacy. The assassin himself became a figure of legend, and of dispute. In some accounts he was a hero, a man who dared to strike against a ruler whose ambition was draining the lifeblood of the people. In others, he was a villain, the architect of a nation's collapse. Ballads and plays reimagined him over centuries, recasting his motives to fit the politics of the time. His name, whether celebrated or cursed, became shorthand for a truth that rulers everywhere understood: the most dangerous enemy is often the one already inside the gates. The lesson history carries forward: the death of the king in his sleep serves as more than a singular tale of betrayal. It is a reminder that power, no matter how absolute it seems, rests on a fragile web of trust, loyalty, and perception. Once that web is broken, even the mightiest fortress can crumble from within. Other kings and emperors would fall in similar ways, stabbed in their tents, poisoned at their tables, strangled in their palaces, but each time the lesson would be the same: no wall is high enough, no guard loyal enough to keep out the shadow that walks beside you. And so the image endures: the empty throne draped in mourning cloth, the seat of power left vacant by a single stroke in the quietest hour of the night. The man is gone, but the act remains, an echo in history, carrying forward the truth that no reign is immortal.